to, just in a second, invite Sarah Munro, Director of Information Propositions from Barclays, back up on the stage, our kind host today, for the first keynote of this afternoon before we move into panels. Do we still need federated digital identity? Sarah, over to you.
Well, I've only been doing this for about 3 years, but I know that there are some people in this room who've been working on digital identity for a long time, and with the advent of open banking, I was thinking, well, maybe they've solved for digital identity. Maybe we can all pack up and go home. So I thought maybe this is the right inflection point. Maybe digital identity has been solved for. Maybe open banking has solved this problem. So can we all pack up and go home? Open banking has the power to revolutionise the way we manage our money, shop around and buy things. Providers will be able to aggregate and transform information from consumer and business accounts, and then be transaction accounts from open banking, and once PSD2 comes around, this will extend to all payments accounts, including easy access savings accounts and credit accounts. And then providers, including traditional banks and third-party payment providers and third-party providers, will be able to use this data, analyse this data, and provide recommendations on different sets of products and services. So could you get a cheaper loan, a better credit card, a better current account that has better services that suit your needs? The aim of open banking is to provide better competition in the marketplace, to provide better products for customers and services. It all sounds pretty good so far. So what happens next? So firstly, for all this to happen, to think about it from a consumer's perspective, not thinking about the standards, which I know that the open banking guys have been really working hard at, is that for a consumer to be able to do this, for every relationship they have, with every financial institution that they have a relationship with, they're going to have to authenticate. They're going to have to give consent to share that information, and that consent is very important. Now, Imran talked about that this morning. That consent and that sharing of information, that consent-driven share of information is very important. But if you think about the friction in that process, it's quite a friction-heavy process. And actually, I think it's quite a good thing. So you want the customer to know that they are giving permission. But if you think about it, if I think about what's in my wallet today, I've got 3 credit cards and a current account. For me, that's 4 different financial relationships I have. That's 4 different permissions I'll have to give. That's either 4 fingerprints, 4 passwords, 4 different permissions that I'll have to grant in that first time that I'm going to share my banking information. That's quite a lot of friction. Will I be bothered? I'm not entirely sure. I might be once, but I'm going to have to renew that permission every 90 days. And I think that renewing of permission is also quite important, but once again, we're introducing friction into that process. It's also important to note that as part of the open banking standard, no personal data will be shared as part of that transaction. And I think that's also very important, because if you think about it, our personal data, and we talked today about the Equifax hack. Now, our personal data is very sacred. If you think about what banks do to verify data through KYC processes, we spend a lot of money doing that. We spend huge amounts of sums keeping that data safe. The amount of money that I know that Barclays spends on cybersecurity is significant. So for us to give away that data through, even if it's through a highly secure standardised API, I know that's something as a bank we've been highly resistant in doing, and something we would really want to do. So open banking provides a basis to share information, to provide standardised transaction data, but actually there is friction for the customer already. But even if I get through that process, so I've given that permission, I've gone through a process, and I've said, actually, there's a better product for me. What happens after that? Oh, they're your customer. So I'm not a KYC expert. There's probably KYC experts in this room, and I'm definitely not one of them. The regulation for KYC is global. It's handed down in UK statute. It's regulated by the FSA, and the practice is, the best guidance is given in the JMLSG. But ultimately, for each organisation, it's a risk-based process. So I've got Dan Johnson here from HSBC, and there might be another bank in the room. What I decide to do for KYC, or my bank decides for KYC, is different what HSBC decides to do.
And actually there was a study that was done earlier this year by PwC on behalf of BBA, which is now UK Finance and GDS, and it looked at the difference between the Verify standard for digital identity verification and the KYC standards and what was done by banks. And actually, it was quite an interesting study, because actually what it showed ultimately is that all the organisations, so whether it's a Monzo, we didn't name the banks by name, so whether it's a startup bank or whether it's a big monolith bank that has a room like this to fit 150 people, we all effectively collect the same information. It might be that a big bank like Barclays with older processes or mature processes, we're pretty upfront. We collect all the information up front, and we make sure you know all the information we're collecting up front. But if you're a startup bank, they want the friction to be less, so they collect far less information up front. They actually collect all the same information. They just do it over a slower period of time. So for banks and financial institutions, we're collecting the same information, and we're just doing it all in very different ways. So same information, same data, collected in very different ways. But we're all collecting the same information. And Thomson Reuters did a study in 2016, and that study showed that for KYC processes for organisations, for banks, that the average bank in the UK spends 40 million on KYC costs. And the highest cost for a bank spending KYC in the UK was at £300 million. So the cost for KYC in the organisations in the UK is absolutely massive. So I suspect that open banking hasn't yet solved our identity problem. So how does that look for a customer? So if you're this is a Barclays branch, somebody's getting help from one of our lovely our colleagues with an iPad, whether the customer goes into one of our branches, or perhaps they go to one of our branches in a box that we take to a university branch, to a university when we set them up temporarily to help students when they're opening their first bank accounts when they go to university. We ask them to take a proof of ID, which is either a driver's license or a passport, or we ask them to bring a bill. If they try to do it online, we use knowledge-based authentication. And for banks and all sorts of organisations, we're constantly looking to refine how we collect and process information. But for every customer trying to prove their identity, as I said before, every organisation is doing it differently. And regardless of how much we invest in user experience, and how much we invest in new technology that might scan a document, because it has to be repeated with every organisation, with every time they set up a new relationship, it's a painful process. And if you happen to have come from overseas, and the statistic hasn't changed because of Brexit, maybe it will over time, 50% of people who join Barclays happen to be new to country. And trying to prove your identity when you're new to country is very painful. When we've done our studies with the Norwegians before, and we did some market research, and we asked people what they did when they opened their bank accounts when they first came to the country. We had some pretty extraordinary experiences. People had such trouble opening bank accounts, they had to go to banks 4 times. They tried 2 or 3 different banks. One person just said, "Oh, it's too hard. Can you pay into my friend's bank account because I can't open a bank account?" So the process of trying to open a bank account in the UK is, if you're new to country, is not a great experience. So we definitely haven't solved for that problem. And the problem, it's not just a banking issue. We still have not solved for this problem. I stole this piece of data from Experience, so Nick, thank you for this. The average customer apparently has 25 online accounts, and they have 5 passwords. I think I'm one of those people. According to CIFAS, the levels of identity theft are reaching epidemic levels. I don't think that's a great statistic, is it? Apparently there were 89,000 cases of identity theft in the UK this year alone. There are 500 cases a year. So for consumers, this is becoming a real living issue. I don't think consumers yet understand the issue of identity theft. And I think when, as a bank, I know we have customers call us saying something's happened to my money, something happened to my information, and they do expect the bank to solve that. And when we did some research last year about what might happen with open banking, and it was quite interesting. When you speak to different customer segments, they respond in different ways. but they do expect the banks to solve this problem for them. So when something goes wrong, they do expect the bank to solve that problem for them. The other thing that was interesting is if you present, particularly with a younger audience, if you present a great customer experience, they'll go, oh yeah, that's great, let's go. And so, I think, with the rise of fintech, when we focus so much on great customer experience, there is a real need to focus on security. There's a real need to make sure that customers understand the value of their data, that customers understand the risks of sharing their data. And so actually, going back to my earlier point, making sure that customers have to authenticate, making sure they absolutely understand the value that they have to provide consent is going to be very important in the open banking world. So there is still a consumer use case. We still have to solve for this problem. And if you think about it for businesses, that the cost for customer abandonment, I think Nick Mothershaw again made a really valuable point about the cost for reissuing passwords, the cost of people who just don't get through the basket experience, who give up, or who only use brands they're comfortable with because they're not going to try new brands because they have to set up new online accounts, who won't switch brands. That's a high cost for that. The cost for, apparently for card losses in the UK were 610 million in 2016, was 9% greater than the year before. So there's a high cost for businesses for not having a central identity system. So definitely for the UK economy, we have a problem with identity that hasn't been solved. So you're not going to be surprised to hear that we still believe in a digital identity solution. We've been working at this for a long time, and I suppose despite what some might describe as the war wounds of Verify, we believe in the federated identity model. And I suppose in many ways, we often look at the overseas models. We look to the Norwegian models and the Danes and the Swedes, and we see that they have built and scaled such a model where citizens can use the same identity to open a bank account, to do a tax return, to check their health record, to even get a divorce. I take heart at such a model, not the divorce thing, mind you, but I do take heart that these models have scaled. I think in Norway there are 5 million people and there are 3.5 million identities. Each one is used 12 times in a year, so these models are used regularly and frequently. When we are talking regularly and frequently to corporates today about what their needs are. And often, if you talk to two different people in an organisation, their needs are different. So if you talk to the KYC guy, they want to talk about cost reduction, they want to talk about the cost of security. If you talk to somebody in marketing, they're talking about customer onboarding and reducing friction. So I don't think we've yet, and particularly as people who are working in this marketplace, I think that we have an issue in figuring out what is the message, what is the value proposition in digital identity, and that's something I think we need to work on moving forward. But I do get a growing sense that there are a set of requirements and there are a set of use cases that we need to coalesce around and to help craft further to take to a marketplace. It's not common. We've spoken to all sorts of organisations and they kind of go, I kind of get it, but it's definitely not a boardroom conversation for most organisations yet. It's beginning to bubble up, but it's definitely not there. But I think there is an opportunity to definitely create those use cases beyond government. But I take comfort that it has happened overseas. I think there is an opportunity in the UK to do so. We certainly haven't given up hope. You'd also not be surprised that we think banks have a role to play. And why do we think that? Well, whilst sometimes people say that banks aren't trusted, people trust their banks. 83% of customers think their banks are trusted. And they trust their banks more than many other institutions that they deal with, more than telcos, more than the organisations they shop with, more than data providers. We're used to verifying data. We spend considerable sums verifying data. We already have KYC and AML processes that aren't that far from the Verify processes. So this is something we're used to doing. We are used to verifying data. We are used to setting standards of verification of data. We already authenticate. Today we have a mobile banking app. We have 5 million, Hal might tell me the number's bigger today. We have 5 million people who log onto our mobile banking app every day. So people are used to authenticating with their fingerprint onto a mobile banking app. They could use that authentication to then use another rich set of services. So they're used to having us verify their data. They're used to authenticating using their mobile banking app. They're great tools with levels of assurance. So these are things they're used to doing at their bank every day. And the other thing is we hold vast sums of data on our customers. Not only do we hold verified attributes about the name, address, date of birth, but we hold significant, obviously, financial and transaction data. So if you take those four things together, they are the tenets of a strong digital identity. And I think that banks, Dave Birch would say that identity is the new oil, but I think that banks have a strong role in scaling digital identity. And I think for us, moving forward, we have a position in helping customers move forward in a trusted way in this new data economy. So what are we doing Well, we continue to be a verified provider. We've been in this space since 2014. And I really am looking forward to hearing Nick speak later. And I'm sure that there are lots of people in this room that have a view about Verify. And I will say this about Verify. Building something from scratch is never easy. And I will applaud the guys at Verify for trying, to create a set of standards from nothing, to build a program from nothing is hard yards. And, to create something that is inclusive. And to do so in a political environment which has been turbulent, to say the least, in the last few years has been very difficult. So we continue to be a supporter of Verify. We hope that the budget says something encouraging about it next Thursday. So we continue to be part of that program. And as an identity provider, we have learned a lot. I think we thought, as I said in the last page, we've got data, we know authenticate, it's going to be easy. Actually, it's not, it's been quite hard. Creating great user experience, matching data across multiple data sets, even using data in our organisation and matching that to data from other organisations, it's really been a hard process. So for us, it's been a constant case of refinement. We continue to learn, we continue to create new opportunities, and we look forward to working with the government in the future. In addition, we are proud supporters of the Open Identity Exchange. I think John would call me the chief agitator on the Open Identity Exchange board. It's a role that I enjoy with great relish. We also have been involved in a number of projects. We're involved in the CEF project at the moment, where we're working with HSBC, IDEMIA, Orange, and GDS about looking at how could you use a French digital identity to open up a bank account in the UK. That project's ongoing at the moment, will finish next year, and that's a project we're very proud on. So we continue to work on many fronts, and we continue to support the digital identity program in the UK. So I don't think I'm saying anything today that hasn't already been said before, so we can probably skip this slide, but let me say it anyway. So what do we think that needs to happen? Well, we need scale, and the scale is a tricky one. It's chicken and egg, right? So we're all standing here going, what's going to create the scale? Who's going to deliver the scale? So organisations are saying, well, I can't participate unless there's scale. But we need somebody to start. So we've got 7 identity providers. We need some relying parties. So what we really need is to get some of the 7 identity providers and some relying parties to get together and figure out what are those use cases going to be to make this thing happen in the private sector. We also need the government to give us permission to do so. So government guys, if you could just give us permission, that would be fantastic. That scale will only come if we get the right people to collaborate. So that collaboration, that scale, is really, really important. But if we don't crack the collaboration, we won't get the scale. These two really go hand in hand. I think the standards are really, really important. Now, it might be that we have different standards evolve. So we've got the Verify standards. It might be that somebody else comes up with different standards as well, and there might be competition between standards, and those standards will compete until one floats to the top, a bit like happened with mobile operators, a bit like happened in other systems. So different standards might compete for a while, and competition isn't a bad thing. So we've invested in Verify, somebody might invest in something else. I don't think we should be concerned about that. If HSBC decides to invest in a different standard for a different reason, am I nervous about that? Well, I'm a little nervous, but I'm not concerned, because we need standards, because without standards and interoperability, we can't have a system, and systems only work with standards. At the moment, we only have one standard for identity verification in the UK, and that is Verify. Whatever people may say, there is no other standard for identity verification in the UK. If somebody else would like to create a new standard for identity verification in the UK, great. But somebody would need to create that standard. So until a new standard exists, Verify is the way. But, you know, competing standards might be a good thing, but somebody would need to do that. And finally, we cannot forget the user. The user often seems to be forgotten in these conversations. We spend a lot of time talking about technical standards and interoperability, but it's like, if we don't put the user at the centre of everything we do, then it will be for nothing. You know, we must put the user at the centre of everything we do. We must think about use cases. Without government and their tireless work with GDS, we wouldn't be here today. They seed-funded OEX at the beginning. They do most of the projects we do today, and they continue to sponsor most of the work. But we can't really continue to ride on their coattails forever. We need to start the work ourselves in the private sector. We need to sponsor more projects. We need to get moving ourselves. So thank you, government, but we really do need to stand on our own 2 feet. We can only be successful if we create a scheme that works in the private sector. And maybe the future work of open banking will be that catalyst. We would love to work with open banking and any other scheme that presents itself that wants to work with digital identity to create interoperability and a federated process. And as I said before, unless we keep customers truly at the heart of what we do and give them control of their identity in a meaningful way, and connected to that, a series of propositions that give them and allow them to get on with their lives, we will fail. So thank you and enjoy the rest of the event.